Good evening again, everyone. My name is Isabel Molina, and I am the public programs producer here at the Museum of Jewish Heritage, a living memorial to the Holocaust. I'm very pleased to welcome you to today's book talk for Resisting Nazism, True Stories of Resistance to the World's Most Dangerous Ideology from 1920 to the Present. Here at the museum, we are dedicated to the crucial mission of educating our diverse community about Jewish life and heritage before, during, and after the Holocaust. As part of that mission, our programs illuminate the stories of survivors, broader histories of hate and anti-Semitism, stories of resistance against injustice, and more. Thank you again for joining us today virtually. We hope that if you're able to, you'll visit the museum in person to see our current and upcoming exhibitions, including Art of Freedom, the life and work of Arthur Szyk, which recently opened on December 7th, 2025. Finally, today we are honored to be joined by Dr. Luke Berryman. Dr. Luke Berryman is the founder and CEO of The Ninth Candle, a Chicago-based nonprofit organization that helps schools to improve Holocaust education. Luke has written about the Holocaust and anti-Semitism for newspapers including the Chicago Tribune, USA Today, and The Guardian, and for pedagogy journals like Education Week and Chalkbeat. He wrote his doctoral thesis on the use of classical music in Nazi propaganda at King's College London. Thank you all again for joining us. I'll hand things over to Luke.
Thank you so much, Isabel, for having me, and thank you so much to everyone for being here. I am going to go ahead and share my screen with you. Um, yeah, my name is Luke. I have recently authored a book called Resisting Nazism. And so this presentation is going to be a whistle-stop tour of the book. Um, and I also want to tell the story behind the book and share with you a few tales of the unexpected along the way. Um, Before I do any of that, though, I would like to say, obviously, every talk that I give about this book is a great privilege, and I'm always excited to connect with people and to tell them about it. But I'm especially grateful to be doing this talk with the Museum of Jewish Heritage this evening. And there's one person in particular I would like to thank before I really get going, and that is Rita Rosenkrantz, who is uh, my literary agent and the person who helped to form what was just a bundle of ideas into a proposal for the book that eventually got published. And Rita has um, a really direct connection with MJH. Her dad was a gallery educator there for many years. You can read about his story, which is really incredible on the MJH's website. And so, yeah, I feel like um, the book has an important connection with MJH that's behind the scenes. So that's why I'm really excited to be here tonight. And thanks again, Rita, for everything that you did to bring this book into the world. Um, so I think the story of this book begins with the Ninth Candle, my non-profit organization. So uh, many years ago, I wrote a PhD about Nazi Germany, and then after that, I went into a career in education. I taught in high schools and universities, both in the US and back in England, which is where I'm from originally. As you may be able to hear, I've been in the US for uh, a decade now, but the accent still hasn't worn off just yet. Um, and I often dreamed during that time of starting an organization that would help to improve Holocaust education. I was having a lot of different experiences in the classroom, and I thought there had to be some way to combine those experiences with the research that I had done to help other teachers. And for a long time, though, that dream was just that. It was just a dream. But then in 2018, I completely unexpectedly made a discovery about my late grandfather's family. So my late grandfather, he passed away in 2006. I knew that he was born in Lithuania. I knew that he had moved to South Africa with his family when he was just a toddler. He was only a couple of years old. And then when he was an adult, that he had moved from South Africa to England. And the story that he always told me and everybody else in the family was that our ancestors had left Lithuania long before the Nazis came. Um, there's really not enough time to tell the full story here. Suffice to say that in 2018, I found out that that was untrue, and that in fact, many aunts, uncles, cousins of my grandfather's had stayed behind in Lithuania, and they'd all been murdered there in 1941. And that lit a fire under me. I became much more serious about this pipe dream that I'd had for a long time. And within 18 months or so of that discovery, the ninth candle had been born. Our goal from the beginning was to champion what schools call inquiry based learning. And I'll talk more about what that means as we go on. But a kind of concise definition is just to say that we teach students how to find and analyze primary historical documents with a view to helping them to understand something about why the Holocaust happened in the time and the place that it did. Um, as I did more and more work with the ninth candle, I found that students were asking one question more than any other on our programs, which was, why didn't more people resist Nazism? Um, and for me, it's a complicated question, and in the book, I kind of discuss in detail that the answer really depends on your definition of resistance. But I think what I'd like to share with you here is that this question really bothered me, right? It wasn't just the fact that it was being asked so often. The fact of it being asked so often was getting under my skin, but it took me a while to figure out why. And eventually I reached a conclusion just within myself that this question revealed a fundamental flaw in US Holocaust education. And that is that too much of it sets out to get an emotional response from students. That's the problem in a nutshell. If, like me, you work with teenagers, or maybe if you have a teenager in the house, they actually have a phrase which I much prefer, which is that it sets out to kick them right in the feels. Um, I think it's actually a really useful phrase because it kind of captures the blunt clumsiness of what pop culture does when it tries to ingest the complexity of the Holocaust. So, I worked with teachers where if they felt that the students had cried or said that they were struggling with the material, that was taken as evidence that they'd gained a deeper understanding of the wrongs of discrimination. And really, in my experience, most teenagers find that quite antagonizing, and rightly so, right? They don't need to be told that mass murder is wrong, and I think that they tend to find it, yeah, just clumsy if their teachers are drawing comparisons between bullying, for example, and the Holocaust. Um, Perhaps more important, um, it leads to the repetitive presentation of Jews as forever victims and Nazis as these kind of anti-heroes, right? These like brutal, very organized, evil supermen almost. I find it's easiest to represent this problem that I'm talking about in a circle. So if the teacher sets out to get an emotional response from their students, then they're going to search for the material that's most likely to get that response. And the material that's most likely to get the response is really highly emotive stories. So I'm thinking of big budget, big blockbuster Hollywood movies, really popular novels that fictionalize the Holocaust, that kind of thing. Now, that material may get an emotional response from the students, but it's not going to help them understand what the Holocaust was or how and why it happened in the time and place that it did. And like I said, it risks patronizing them in the process. Then the teacher will often find, or the school will find, that none of this is really sunk in. Sometimes that manifests itself in really horrible ways, like anti-Semitic graffiti in the bathroom, for example, an occurrence that's more common than you may think in high schools. And so they set out to teach it all again, but just double down on existing teaching methods. And there we are back at the beginning. The Ninth Candle began offering programs like to tackle this question, and to get into that problem. We began offering programs that preempted the question. And so that meant scouring through all of the literature for people who are less famous, for people who weren't necessarily really familiar already, and whose stories would contradict any pre existing ideas that students may have picked up about Jews being forever victims and Nazis being these kind of anti heroes, like I said. And I also wanted to problematize the idea of resistance itself. I found that, especially in the context of Holocaust Ed, when students are being taught about resistance, they're more often than not taught about larger than life figures who are kind of unimpeachable and who did incredible heroic things. And um, absolutely, I understand the reasons for teaching students about figures like that. And obviously, they're very important for us all to memorialize and celebrate. But I wanted students to realize that resistance can be more complicated. It can have multiple meanings, it can have layers, it can take all different shapes and forms. And I think importantly, I wanted to treat Nazism as an ideology, right? Again, when we talk about resistance to Nazism, what we normally mean is resistance to the Nazi regime between 1933 and 1945. But Nazism is an ideology. It was born in 1920 and it has survived all the way up to the present. There were many people who resisted it before Hitler and the Nazi Party came to power in 1933. There are many people who continue to resist it after the Nazi Party had collapsed and the war was over in 1945. So I wanted to treat it as an ideology that had lasted this great breadth of time. And as we built all of these programs, eventually I had this large collection of true stories of resistance to Nazism that spanned 1920 up to the present. And I began to feel like this is something that could really work as a book. To do that, though, I needed something that would kind of stitch it and thread it all together. And some work from the early 1980s by a German historian named Detlev Peukert, who certainly outside professional academic history has been more or less forgotten. He himself has a really interesting story. He passed away when he was a very young man, when he was only in his late 30s. So his career was cut tragically short, but the work that he did do was really remarkable. And so in this book about the Edelweiss pirates, um, he drew this graph to explain that resistance can have all sorts of levels. And I'll just translate this. So on the axis here, it begins with partial criticism of the system going all the way up to a more general criticism of the system. And then this axis, it starts in the private sphere and goes all the way to the public sphere. And the graph goes up through non-conformity and then refusal or non-compliance. And then if that continues, it leads to protest. And then eventually we have the acts of active political resistance right at the top. So if you are engaged in very kind of overall criticism of the system and you're doing it in a way that's very public, that's active political resistance. But he wanted to draw attention to the fact that even a partial criticism that's done only in private still counts as resistance, right? Maybe it needs a different label on it, but it still belongs on the graph. So that was like the theoretical framework for the book. And then for additional depth, I decided I was going to augment all of these stories with interviews with eyewitnesses and experts. And the end product was 12 chapters that are divided into four broad time periods: before the war, during the war, the immediate aftermath of the war in 1970 to the present. So, in part one, I write about cartoonists in 1920s Germany, then Sebastian Haffner, a journalist who was active in the late 1920s up to through the 30s, and the Edelweiss pirates. So in the 1920s, there were many people who resisted Nazism. They were, for the large part, intellectuals, academics, journalists. But I believe the most persistent of them were cartoonists who worked for satirical magazines. And in the chapter, what I try and do is track the development of their cartoons as the 1920s unfold. Broadly speaking, they go from poking fun at Hitler, making fun of him as this fringe novelty act in the early 1920s, to kicking him while he's down after the failed coup attempt in 1923, and then by 1928-29, their cartoons transform into these warnings that are much darker and much more macabre. Um, One of the things that surprised me was the fates of all of these people. They really ran the gamut. Some of them, after 1933, basically apologized for all of the cartoons that they'd done. They cozied up to the regime and started producing anti-Semitic and anti-democratic material themselves. But others went into a much more um, uh, kind of clear-cut mode of resistance, where they were helping Jews to hide, for example. So uh, one of the magazines I looked at is called Simplicissimus, or Simple for short, and they ran one of the first ever anti-Nazi cartoons, which was published in spring 1923 by a Jewish cartoonist, Thomas Theodor Heine, and it's called "What Does Hitler Look Like?" Now, I'm kind of I have to keep one eye on the time because I could easily spend the entire presentation just talking about this one cartoon. It's so extraordinary. Just a bit of background in the early 1920s, um, Hitler didn't want to be photographed. It's kind of very difficult for us to compute today because his image remained so iconic. But in the early 1920s, he didn't want to be photographed. He was afraid that photographs that were being reproduced thousands and thousands of times would diminish the aura that he was trying to build around himself. So a lot of people had heard of him. Most of them had no idea what he looked like. And this cartoon is a speculation on that. It's deliberately laid out in this panel form so that it looks a bit like those eugenic charts that you might see in a Holocaust museum from the early 20th or late 19th century. And basically, in each one, he's going through and saying, is it the eyes that are the main feature, or is it his mouth? Is it his beard? Does he have a big chin? Does he have a big forehead? The one that I think is the most arresting is right at the bottom right hand corner, where the little caption says, the question, what does he look like, will have to remain unanswered because Hitler isn't a person, he's a phenomenon. And this phenomenon could only be pictured by a futurist or an abstract artist. And so there's this really dark, quite serious image there. You can see the fasces, the symbol of fascism that have been stuck into a beer mug, which is a reference to the birth of Nazism in Munich's beer halls. There's this providential eye staring down from the sky. There's bolts of lightning. There's swastikas flying through the night. It's a really incredible image. But like I said, by the time we get to the early 1930s, these cartoons have uh, dropped all of the joking and the making fun, and they're just trying to warn people. This is one that appeared in 1932. It shows Hitler as a butcher, and on his apron it says, "War against France, war against Russia, war against our neighboring states. Heads will roll," and then there are these smeared, bloody handprints and the Stars of David. Um, Everything on this apron came to pass. I think that the cartoonist who drew it would have been as surprised as anybody. He wasn't predicting the future. He was making an argument for what the worst case scenario would be if we continued down this path. Um, so yeah, many more cartoons that I analyze in the chapter, but that's just kind of a quick taster. Sebastian Haffner was in later life, he eventually became a famous journalist and writer, best known for books like Germany, Jekyll and Hyde, and also The Meaning of Hitler. If you don't know him, and if you don't know Jekyll and Hyde, you may know The Meaning of Hitler because it was used as the basis for a Netflix documentary that came out, I think, in 2020, relatively recently. Um, After his death at the end of the 20th century, his son Oliver discovered an old manuscript that was just stuffed into a drawer in his desk. And it turned out to be an unfinished memoir that was describing Sebastian's life in early 1930s Germany. Um, it was eventually published under the title Defying Hitler, although that's not the title that Hafner gave it himself. Um, After it was published, there's an extraordinary story of it being accused of being an elaborate forgery, which turned out to be completely incorrect. I think perhaps because of that, this book has kind of flown under the radar and it's been underestimated for a long time. But it gives a really invaluable insight into everyday life under Hitler. And it's also a reminder that something as simple as interrogating oneself and one's daily life and one's actions can be the first step toward really effective resistance. Um, one of the interviewees in this chapter was Sebastian's son, so I was very privileged to be able to connect with him and to hear more about his father's story. The Edelweiss Pirates were loosely organized groups of working class kids in Germany who refused to join the Hitler Youth. Um, their stories went untold for decades after the war in Germany because they came from these working class backgrounds. The Nazis did their best to smear them. They were kind of criminals. They were described as criminals, like lowlifes, pickpockets, that kind of thing. And even now, there are efforts going on in Germany to rehabilitate their reputations. In the book, I interview some of the people who are spearheading those efforts. So there are some books about these kids written in German. Very few of them have been translated into English. They've just not, their stories just haven't really made it into the English speaking imagination. But a lot of them engaged in direct action against the Nazis. It wasn't just that they declined to join the Hitler Youth. A lot of them went on from there to do things that were far more risky. And some of them were even detained in concentration camps as a result of their actions. Um, they eventually did enough to come onto the radar of Heinrich Himmler himself, who ordered a brutal crackdown against them. And that crackdown is something that I track in the book, and just try and cast some light on some of these actions that have been undeservedly forgotten. So, before we go on to part two, a quick break with Tale of the Unexpected #1, which is that I came across an incredible story of resistance just a bit too late. I found this one after the manuscript had been published. This is an image of the Nuremberg synagogue. It was demolished by the Nazis in 1938 in what was a prelude to Kristallnacht. They tore down this one, realized they could get away with it, and then a few months later, there was action on a far larger scale. I came across this secret police report, um, which says that the so-called Judenstein, the Jew's stone, like a kind of symbolic foundation stone, was rescued from this synagogue and taken to a Jewish cemetery, and that was all arranged by a man who was a member of the Nazi Party. Of course, we can see from this report that he was dismissed from the party, that he was publicly lambasted for it. All I know is that his name was Fritz Fish. This is something that's kind of on the back burner for me. I would love to do more research and try and find out more about this because I think it's really remarkable. The most remarkable thing of all is that thanks to the actions of Fritz Fish, this stone was saved and it is in the new synagogue that is there in Nuremberg today. So just a little snapshot. Even now, I'm coming across these kind of stories all the time. They are out there. So, part two. Obviously, when you're talking about the period between 39 and 45, there are many spectacular stories of resistance. I made the difficult decision to omit the stories about people escaping from Chelmno, also the uprisings in Auschwitz and Treblinka. There are lots of ghettos where there were armed uprisings against the Nazis. I also deliberately omitted the stories about Oskar Schindler and Anne Frank because, like I said, the purpose of the book is to shine a light on figures who are less familiar. So, in the end, I chose one story about a German who resisted, one story about Jews who resisted, and one story about Allied forces resisting. So, they were respectively Kurt Gerstein, Alexander Peczewski, and the British Field Security Sections. So, Kurt Gerstein was a German nationalist and an evangelical Christian who eventually joined the SS. He joined the SS around the same time that his sister-in-law, a woman named Bertha Ebeling, was murdered in a euthanasia facility in Hadmar, which you can see there in the background. Kurt turned against the Nazis, but he did so secretly. He rose through the ranks of the SS. He was an intelligent man. He was a mining engineer and a medic. And he became the head of technical disinfection services. And in that role, he was responsible for providing clean drinking water, for providing sewage treatment and pest control all across the expanding empire as the war went on. Um, in August 1942, he was told about the extermination camps that were on the eastern side of occupied Poland, and he was given a tour or a chance to tour Belzec and Treblinka. And in Belzec, he witnessed the process of Jews being gassed from start to finish. This completely horrified him. He left the camp a broken man, but he was determined to tell the world about what he had seen. So he went back to Germany and began this process of desperately trying to blow the whistle and to alert the world to what was happening. Um, I won't spoil it. If you're unfamiliar with the story, I won't tell you how his story ends. It's gripping, it's complicated. In many ways, it's a really tragic tale. One of the quotes that really stayed with me, I found a letter that he wrote to his father. He didn't tell his father what he was doing, what he was getting involved with when he got back to Germany, but he just said, it's the fate of all those with a spark of daring in them to risk all that they possess, even their substance, for the sake of an uncertain gain. What a great quote. Um, Alexander Peczewski was a Jew and an officer in the Soviet army who was captured, detained by the Nazis, and ultimately sent to the Sobibor extermination camp in September 1943. You can see a photo of Sobibor there in the background. That is a picture of Peczewski himself. He was not long in Sobibor before he had made his way into a resistance group that already existed. Now, this resistance group was made up completely of civilians. They knew that they wanted to get out of the camp, but they really didn't know how they were going to do it. None of them had any kind of military training, so they had the will, but they lacked the knowledge. And as an officer, that's precisely what Peczewski could bring to their group. So he helped them to come up with an escape plan that was extremely ambitious, but was also still practical. It was workable. And they launched their escape attempt on October 14th, 1943. Again, I could easily spend the whole presentation just talking about Peczewski and what he did. But I won't include any spoilers here. But suffice to say, it's a really remarkable instance of resistance. The British Field Security Section. So my sixth chapter. Originally, this was going to be about a man named Hans Alexander. You may have heard of him. He is the German Jew who fled Germany, went to England, joined the Allied forces, got involved in intelligence, and ended up capturing and arresting Rudolf Höss, the commandant of Auschwitz after the war. His story's already been told in a beautiful book by one of his descendants. I wanted to dig a bit further into it, but as I started going through the archives of the Imperial War Museum in London, which you can see there in the background, I found a wealth of extraordinary stories about intelligence operations that had just never seen the light of day. The field security sections, They worked in the ruins of Nazi Germany to try and track Nazi war criminals down, to arrest them and to bring them to justice. And they also tried to ensure that there was no resurgence of Nazism in post-war Germany. Um, these people were spurred by an incredible sense of duty. They swore an oath of secrecy when they joined the intelligence services, and the majority of them observed that oath until the end of their lives. They very rarely even told their own families about what they had done during the war. And even for those who did write something down, they were often so self deprecating about it. It never ceased to amaze me. This is one memoir that I found in the archives that I talk about in the book. It's the foreword, as you can see, and just look at this paragraph. This story will not contain anything to elevate the mind or any grand theories, and apart from personal satisfaction, it has no purpose whatsoever. I think this is meant to be a joke. I think this is a kind of dry British humor, but I think it reveals something about how modest these people were, and yeah, how lightly they viewed their own achievements. So it was yeah, fascinating to explore their stories in that chapter. Okay, a second tale of the unexpected. As I was writing this book, I was really astonished to find just how important the arts were to so many of the resistors on whom I was trying to cast a light. They were frequently obsessed with literature, with music, with art, with poetry. And I think that's because the arts are a crucial ingredient in resistance because they connect us to our own humanity, to ideas and issues that are timeless and that are bigger than ourselves. I sometimes get pushback for saying it, but I've really come to believe it that if you want to become a better resistor, one of the best and first things that you can do is just go to a concert, go to a museum, join a book club, join your local library. All of these activities do constitute resistance to far right extremism, because far right extremism depends on followers being insular. It depends on people not being able to see beyond themselves or their own immediate needs. I don't think she would mind me sharing this with you. Someone that I'm going to talk about just in a little moment, Karina Kolmas. I was emailing her. Karina spent a good deal of the 1970s and 80s going around Europe trying to track down Nazi war criminals. And I had emailed her asking her for more information on one of the men that she found. And I just loved this opening response. I'm too busy to email you right now because I'm in a workshop for chamber music. Even now, she is just completely dedicated to the arts in a way that I think is wonderful. So, part three. The third part of the book deals with the years between 1950 and 1970. What I wanted to do here was capture the ways in which Nazism was resisted as the world began coming to terms with the Holocaust and just dealing generally with the aftermath of World War II. And the people that I zoomed in on were Leon Bass, Emmy Bonhoeffer, and Gita Sereni. So Leon Bass was a Black American soldier who ended up liberating the Buchenwald concentration camp. By his own account, he wrote a self-published autobiography. He was an angry and frustrated young man because he had been asked to defend freedoms that he wasn't afforded himself as a person of color in the United States. In a really remarkable story that I wish I had more time to tell in more detail now, he was later reunited with Robbie Weissman. Robbie was one of the people inside Buchenwald when Leon walked in through the gate, and they came back into each other's lives decades later. Leon passed away in 2015, but I think one of the most exciting moments for me when I was writing the book was when I managed to track down Robbie in Vancouver. He's in his 90s, but he was still very keen to speak. And that interview is part of the book of which I'm really proud and just honored that I was able to speak to him. Emmy Bonhoeffer was the wife of Klaus Bonhoeffer and the sister-in-law of the famous Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Right? If we're thinking about Holocaust education, Dietrich Bonhoeffer is a name that comes up reasonably regularly, but the rest of the Bonhoeffer family not so much. The story of Emmy's efforts to save her husband after he'd been arrested by the Nazis. That story is spectacular in itself. Again, like I wish I had time to tell it now, but it is there in the book. As far as I know, it's the first time that it's been told anywhere in English. It, for whatever reason, just has not made it out of Emmy's own book, which is only available in German. Again, which I think is an incredible shame because it's an amazing book. But anyway, years later, as the Frankfurt Auschwitz trial is getting underway, one of the first big trials of Nazi war criminals in post-war Germany, she was really horrified, disappointed, stunned by the poor treatment of Jewish survivors in that trial. And so she set up a support group to help them as they took the stand. She conducted herself very quietly. She didn't seek any publicity for this. She did it more or less out of the public eye, but she triggered a movement. She triggered a movement that helped bring people to justice. And yeah, I think a story that has a lot of relevance for today and where we are right now because she followed the truth because it was the truth, and that was all. Gita Sereni was a British Austrian journalist who wanted to understand Nazi war criminals. She wanted to understand how they'd become the people that they'd become. She wanted to understand why they had done what they'd done. She spent years searching for someone that she thought would be a right subject to interview. And that search eventually led her to a man named Franz Stangl, who was the commandant of Treblinka, but before that, the commandant of Sobibor, and before that, had worked on the euthanasia program. So Stangl had easily overseen the murders of more than 1 million people in the course of his career. Um, she managed to interview him for 70 hours while he was in prison. And at the end of that process, she managed to extract a confession of guilt from him. She also managed to unearth details about the Holocaust that the Nazis had ordered to remain hidden forever. That is a photo of Gita and Stangl and one of their interviews going on in the prison. The end of her process was this remarkable book, Into That Darkness, which I leaned on a lot in my chapter. And again, like Defying Hitler by Sebastian Haffner is one that I can wholeheartedly recommend. It's an incredible piece of work. The final part of the book deals with resistance to Nazism, both the legacy of the Third Reich and the Holocaust and the survival of far-right extremism at the end of the 20th century and up to the present. So here I chose to focus on the movie Shoah, on the Holtzman Amendment, and on so-called formers. I'll come to what that term means shortly. But first, Shoah. So Shoah, you may know, you may be familiar with already the epic documentary by Claude Lanzmann, the French filmmaker. He spent years traveling the world to interview survivors, bystanders, and perpetrators of the Holocaust. There he is. Unlike Gita Sereni, Lanzmann was explicitly opposed to the idea that the Holocaust could ever be understood. In fact, he argued that any attempt to understand the Holocaust was obscene. And so in the book, I've got Sereni and Lanzmann right next to each other, and I feel like it makes a nice juxtaposition of approaches that are kind of similar, but guiding principles that are completely and utterly different. Lanzmann's only goal was just to capture the truth of what had happened and to capture it on film. I was especially interested in the interviews that he had conducted with perpetrators because they often involved subterfuge and lying to the perpetrator and a good deal of risk as well. Sadly, Lanzmann passed away a while ago, but there are people around who worked on the movie with him, and I mentioned Karina Kolmas earlier. I was very lucky to be able to interview her and to hear her story. She worked on this movie from start to finish. So I had some incredible experiences with Lanzmann and with all of the people who appear in the movie. If you've not seen Shoah, please go away, watch it now. It is, for me, hands down the best movie that's ever been made about the Holocaust and probably the best that ever will be made. The Holtzman Amendment. So the penultimate chapter of the book focuses on the story of people who worked to unearth Nazi war criminals who came to live in hiding in the United States after the war was over. Their pursuit of justice was years in the making. It met with opposition at almost every turn. So Elizabeth Holtzman is a New York based lawyer and politician who spearheaded this movement. There she is. And Ralph Blumenthal is a veteran New York Times journalist who covered the movement and who also spurred it on. Among other things, Ralph unearthed and confronted a Romanian war criminal, Valerian Trifa, in his church compound in Michigan, which in itself is just an absolutely incredible story. So I, again, felt very fortunate that Elizabeth Holtzman and Ralph Blumenthal both agreed to be interviewed for the book and to share their memories of all the work that they had done and just very inspiring stories of determination in very, very difficult circumstances. So, formers. Former is the name that is sometimes given to people who used to belong to white supremacy or neo-Nazi movements who have left those movements and turned against them. I approached this chapter, as you can probably imagine, with a great deal of caution. There is, I think, a bit of a cottage industry of tell-all books by formers. And a lot of them, I read many of them as I was searching for someone to interview. And I'm sorry to say that many of these books left me rather uncomfortable. If you have seen the movie The Wolf of Wall Street, and this is a comparison I make in the book, sometimes they struck me as being kind of similar to that. The Wolf of Wall Street starts out as what seems like it seems like it's going to be a kind of salutary tale about greed and overindulgence and all that kind of thing, but it actually ends up glamorizing, kind of accidentally glamorizing the man at the heart of the story. Um, Similarly, with many books by formers, um, they will say, yes, I was bad and I did terrible things and I'm sorry. And now let me tell you just how bad I was. And it becomes kind of voyeuristic. And the victims of these people are just turned into these anonymous figures who are like tools of self-discovery for the person writing the book. So I wrestled with this chapter a lot. I eventually came to a man named Arno Michaelis, who struck me as being genuinely different and as having a very different approach to other formers. Our interview was the longest of all of the 30 that I conducted. We spoke for hours and hours. It was also the most challenging because I didn't just want to hear his story. I also wanted to contest him on some points, but I found him to be very authentic, very sincere, very earnest in the peace advocacy work that he does today, and the risks that he takes himself to try and build bridges and to undo some of the wrongs that are in his past. He founded an organization called Life After Hate. And although he's not directly involved with it today, it has a wonderful legacy. And I spoke to people at Life After Hate as well about the work that they do right now to help people escape from far right movements, which I learned while I was writing this chapter are often more like religious cults than they are like political movements. They're extremely complicated and they have very sophisticated ways of preying on recruits, and that's something I write about in the book. So, Tale of the Unexpected number 3. You won't know it from reading the book, but I completed the manuscript of Resisting Nazism while I was on parental leave. So, my first child, a son, was due to be born on December 16th, 2024. The manuscript was due to the publisher on January 15th, 2025. All through 2024, I was working with the date December 16th in mind. I made a solemn agreement with my unborn son that he would not arrive before that date. And we got to the night of December 8th, and I thought, I've still got a lot of work to do, but if I put in a solid 8 hours every day for the next week, I'm going to have this manuscript done. I can put it to one side, baby can arrive, and I can just enjoy that moment. As it was, the waters broke on the morning of December 9th, and the rest of the month of December turned out to be rather busy. This is a photo that my wife took. You can see there on the sofa is scattered the pages of the latest copy of Resisting Nazism. On the desk, there's a book about the Edelweiss pirates, and underneath it, the Chicago Manual of Style. And there in my lap is a 3.5 week old baby. So, yeah, it was a difficult time, but it was also a really special moment in my life, finishing this book with the baby there. So, just very quickly, what I hope readers will take away from the book. Well, there are two quotes at the front, and I hope that it will be obvious that they're not just there as arbitrary quotes. What I wanted to do with these 12 stories, all threaded together, is encapsulate what these two quotes are saying. So one is from Hannah Arendt, that even in the darkest of times, we have the right to expect some illumination from the uncertain, flickering, and often weak light that some men and women in their lives and their works will kindle under almost all circumstances. And then one from the French philosopher Frederick Gross, when the state takes iniquitous decisions and engages in unjust policies, the individual cannot rest content with complaining before going off to sleep. He or she is not merely authorized to disobey as if this were a right that might or might not be taken up in the name of conscience. Rather, I have a duty to disobey if I am to remain faithful to myself. So, obviously, in the conclusion, I flesh out many more takeaways from these stories, but to compress them onto a single slide, that's what I hope they will encapsulate the spirit of these two quotes. So we're just about at the end. Thank you so much for listening. The book is called Resisting Nazism. I remember Isabel said she was going to post a link, but you can also use that QR code to find it with Bloomsbury, the publisher. I would warmly invite everyone to come visit the Ninth Candle. We have a free monthly newsletter that you can sign up for. You can also just learn more about our work on our website. With whatever time we've got left, I'm very happy to take any questions that you may have. If your question doesn't get answered or if something comes to mind later on, please feel free to email me. I love hearing from people. I'm always happy to engage. And otherwise, the only thing that's left to say is thanks ever so much for listening.
Well, thank you so much for that incredible presentation. We have some great questions from the audience already that I'll dive right into. But just a reminder to the audience, if you feel so inspired while we're talking, definitely feel free to submit more questions. Um, I'll start with a question someone submitted that actually goes back to the beginning of your presentation when you talked about the inspiration for the Ninth Candle and also for this book was that you kept getting asked, why didn't more people resist? And this audience member is wondering, after you've sort of implemented these changings into Holocaust teachings and maybe after reading the book, if you've noticed that there's a different sort of common question that keeps coming up, or if it's sort of just all different.
Yeah, that is a great question. No, I don't think so. I think that I like to think at least that the way in which we tackle that question triggers a fundamental shift in how students see this topic generally. I like to think that it uh, convinces them that they can no longer trust, or at least no longer take as gospel, the stuff that they see in movies, the stuff that they see on TikTok, and that they need to start questioning and querying everything. Um, and that hopefully it helps them realize that there's a wealth of stuff out there that needs to be studied properly in order to have any kind of grasp on this enormous and enormously challenging subject. So, one question, yeah, probably actually, just talking through that answer, um, they ask, where can I find out more? How can I learn more about this? And that's a question that I'm happy for them to ask.
Yeah, that's a great question to have at the end. Um, we have someone else who's asking, somewhat relatedly, what the reaction to this book has been like and if you've noticed if different groups of people are reacting differently, specifically if students react in a particular way that might differ from adult audiences, or if educators are, responding in a way that maybe other readers aren't.
That's a great question. So the book is still very young. It's younger than the baby was in the photo. So it was published on Thursday last week. So I think it's probably a bit too early for me to be summarizing the reactions that it's had so far. Um, I will say that I wrote it in a style that I hoped would make it accessible to teenagers, but also still enjoyable for adult audiences. So yeah, ask me that question again in 6 months' time, and I hope that I'll have a better answer.
Well, thank you and congratulations again on the recent
Thank you.
publication. Um, we have a somewhat practical question. One of
Mhm,
our audience members noticed that you spoke about a lot of materials that were primarily written in German, and hadn't
mhm.
been translated. So someone's wondering if you speak any German, and if not, if that led to any language barrier obstacles that you had to overcome.
Well, there are always language barrier obstacles. I certainly am not fluent enough to rely on my own translations, especially when you're dealing things with things like cartoons from the
Mhm.
1920s, where the captions are sometimes so idiomatic, not just in German, but like in a regional dialect that was spoken 100 years ago but isn't spoken anymore. So there are three people that I mention in the acknowledgements that I thank for their help with the translations. So yeah, I'm good enough with it that I can make my way around some of these sources, but I would always ask someone else, just because there are so many nuances that can get lost. There are so many different ways uh, that you can translate one phrase from one language to another. Often, there are phrases that have no direct translation.
Mhm.
Um, so yeah, it always helps to have a second or even a third opinion. So yeah, I try to tread very carefully with the translations.
Great. Thank you. We have a couple questions that I'm going to combine because they're both
Okay.
about the research process for this book. And I know you touched on this a bit during your presentation, but someone is wondering if you would talk just a bit more about the research process for this book, how you went about finding sources, deciding which sources to use, um, and also how you decided which stories you wanted to include. I know you mentioned you wanted to go with lesser known stories, but even, after discarding all the famous ones, how did you go about deciding which were the best fit and which you would include in the book?
Yeah, that's yeah, those are great questions. So um the process of choosing the stories was often often quite complicated because yeah, I wanted them to be lesser known stories, but at the same time, I needed to be certain that I had enough material to have a story to tell, right? And sadly, especially when one's dealing with the Jewish communities that were destroyed in the Holocaust, the Nazis didn't just murder the individuals concerned; they destroyed um, every trace of them as well. So that means often that evidence is really thin on the ground. Um, so it was kind of a process of trial and error. I'd also made this decision that I wanted to have interviews with eyewitnesses and experts. And so sometimes it hinged on their availability as
Mhm.
well. And not everybody that I asked for an interview said yes. So I had to be ready to pivot and parry, and um, so that yeah, that it took a while to settle on the 12 stories. As for the research process, um, a lot of it had been done in the background for the Ninth Candles programs. And there are a lot of archives that I was familiar with already from my PhD and the research that I'd done for that. Um, but at the same time, like I said, with the story of the member of the Nazi Party who helped the Jews in Nuremberg to hide that foundation stone, you come across new things all the time. Just when you're looking for it, you come across them all the time. So yeah, there's a wealth of resources out there, not just archival material, but primary source documents that have been published and printed. And um, it's just that, yeah, for whatever reason, they haven't lodged in kind of discourse about this subject in a way that I think they deserve to. So I will say actually as well that the book at the very end has a section of recommended reading. Like
Yes.
rather than a traditional academic bibliography, I figured it would be more useful for people who are reading the book to know about the books that I read as I was putting it together and the ones that I thought were the best. So you'll find that section in the back, and hopefully that'll be a useful thing as well.
Thank you for sharing. It looks like we're just about at time. So I think that will have to be our
Okay.
last question, but I think it's a nice place to leave off on, and you can always consult the book and those suggested readings if you'd like more information. Apologies to our audience if we didn't get to your questions. I know there were a few that we didn't have the chance to get to. But before we end off, I would just like to take a moment to thank you, Luke, for joining us and providing this presentation this evening. And of course, to our audience as well. Lastly, if you enjoyed today's program, we hope you'll consider making a donation to support the museum, which you can do at mjhnyc.org/support. And we hope that you'll join us for our upcoming programs, which you can find at mjhnyc.org/current events. Both of those links are in the chat for you as well. So again, thank you all so much for joining us. We hope that you have a great night, and we'll see you soon.